ኤፍኤም አፍደገ ዘመናዊ ትግራይ
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Today we are here. This is, I think, the fourth week, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but don't quote me on that. But yes, okay, I've got visual confirmation. Yes, this is the fourth week that this has been running. This is to commemorate the genocide on Tigray. 5 years in, we are still talking about the fifth week. Sorry, I stand corrected. So we are gathered here today to talk about justice and accountability, and we have different practitioners and experts in the field who are able to kind of give us a bit more of an insight. These are people who have been committed to talking about justice and accountability when it comes to the genocide in Tigray, or approaching it in various different ways, but still as impactful. And we would just like to have this discussion to kind of have a bit more of an insight for the community and also for those outside on what it really means to pursue justice in the current state that we're in. Acknowledging that we are in a very in a very difficult kind of situation, but it's post-conflict, but also not, because there is also a lot of threat to conflict restarting. And that has caused a lot of fears and insecurity and instability, as you can imagine. So we can go to our guests. I think I can introduce them, but I probably won't do them justice. So hopefully they can introduce themselves a bit more. We have 3 guests with us here today. We have 2 so far. I think one will join us very soon. But the first guest I will introduce is Joanne. Joanne Hodges, she's a human rights defender and a filmmaker. She's interested in social justice and human rights issues. She's a board member of the Ethiopian Canadian for Peace and on the advisory board of the Northern Justice Watch, a member of the United Tagaru Canada, a member of Tigray Advocacy Canada, a co-founder of Friends of Tigray, and a founding member of the Alliance of Genocide Victims Community, which she formed along with representatives of Tigrayan, Tibetan, Tamil, Uyghur, and Rwandan communities. Welcome, Joanne. I think you definitely know how to time manage, because you have founded and established a lot of really great initiatives. So kudos to you. Thank you for joining us, Joanne.
Thank you a lot. Good to be here.
Great. And then next we have James Joseph. James is he has supported survivors of atrocities and conflict in societies that are usually overlooked by the global north, filling in that gap and trying to kind of compensate for that disparity that exists there. He works in capacity building, creating change, and putting justice in the hands of the most affected of injustice, and humanizing the legacy of atrocities behind the politics of pressing human rights crisis. He is a founder of the Duty Legacy, if I'm not mistaken, and he has undertaken many different initiatives that aims to represent these communities who have yet to receive justice and accountability for crimes that they have been undergoing for the last couple of years, or even longer. James, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your presence. And then we have Sarah Tish. I think Sarah, if I'm saying her surname right, I'm not quite sure, but I don't think she's quite here yet. I think she'll join us shortly. But Sarah's a Toronto-based attorney. She holds a JD from the University of Toronto and an MA in counterterrorism and homeland security. She studied law at Mekelle University and National University of Singapore. She's been involved with the Monk School of Global Affairs, an International Institute for Counterterrorism, and projects for the ICC. She focuses on working with international human rights and national security law, and she's also affiliated with groups like Canadian Coalition Against Terror and the Canadian Security Research Group, and so on. And she's also founded the Human Rights Action Group. So thank you all for joining us today. I know that I think James will begin with a bit of intro, and then I don't know if you guys have presentations, and then we can kind of open it up and make it an interactive discussion.
Yeah, I'm just gonna speak if that's okay. So as long as you can all hear me, okay. I'll just speak. Yeah, so I'm gonna speak a little on preventing genocide, strategies for how we commit towards a safer future, and how we ensure that non-repetition of these acts that we've seen in Tigray and elsewhere. So I'll mention Tigray, but I'll also mention a few other conflicts where we've seen similar atrocities, and how either justice has been granted, justice has been gained, or whether they're still fighting for justice. But I'll start by just saying, if I may, that we are not just here to commemorate genocide or commemorate atrocities that have happened in Tigray, but we're also here to confront a lot of the atrocities that have happened, and we're sort of here to indict the present moment and to seize that future from being stolen again. We also come just in the midst of the anniversary of the Axum massacre, where Eritrean soldiers attacked Axum residents on November the 28th until the following morning, where they shot indiscriminately and executed many people in the streets, went house to house doing searches. And the obvious targets, as with genocides such as Bosnia and elsewhere, were men and boys. And this continued, as we know, in Axum until I've probably said that completely wrong, but please do correct me, until the 30th of November. And these atrocities, again, they weren't sort of discovered until many months later. As we don't need to go over the details particularly, but this was where Eritrean forces, shot at residents who tried to collect the dead. They were also collecting bodies from locations throughout Axum in the streets, outside homes, and this is one of a myriad of acts of genocidal atrocity that Tigrayans have faced. And I'll start by saying this, that genocide is never an accident. It is never ancient hatreds which are exploding. It is never political tensions which have burst into something more. It is always a political project that is meticulously planned, publicly advertised, systematically resourced, and then executed with industrial efficiency, while the world drafts another statement, another resolution condemning what has happened, another statement which repeats deep concern. We've known this since Raphael Lemkin sat in this very city here in London in 1948 and forced the world to adopt the Genocide Convention. He knew, like we all know now, that political will would be the decisive factor. Political will is core to any determination of genocide. And like we see with the atrocities, whether it be Gaza, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be in going back to Bosnia, whether it be in Armenia, in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, whether it be in Sudan, South Sudan, whether it be in the myriad of conflicts, that's just me mentioning a few, across the world where justice is still being sought. He knew that political will would be the decisive factor. He designated lobbying arguments tailored to each country's history and fears and interests, that there would be justice. He begged the world to turn off the propaganda tools, the radio stations, the schools, the press that were pushing for genocide, and push that into tools for prevention instead of destruction. 77 years later, if I've got my maths correct, we have more knowledge, better early warning systems, and stronger legal mechanisms than Lemkin back then could ever have dreamed of. And yet we still see the inability to determine, the inability to act, the inability to take action that prevents these atrocities when they are being occurred and when they are reoccurring. We have the technology, and yet entire communities are still being erased. Women are still being raped as a weapon of war. While we debate whether a genocide and the word genocide is diplomatically convenient, our ignorance is that this is all a choice. And today we will start to confront that choice. That's my first point. Secondly, one of the things I've learned from so much work that I've done on Tigray particularly, but elsewhere, is that Civil society is the only actor that cannot be bought, cannot be bullied, and cannot be vetoed. States have geopolitical interests. We all know this. Civil society has the memory, has the ability to grieve, and the unbreakable moral authority to take action. This is why perpetrators always target human rights defenders. They always target journalists. They always target those religious clerics, the priests first. In Tigray, where the Ethiopian federal government, Ethiopian forces, and Amhara militias have imposed a total siege on community blackouts since November 2020, it was Tigrayan doctors who continued operating on patients by torchlight while recording their names of the dead, or whatever scrap of paper they could find. It was the priests who hid memory cards full of evidence in church tabernacles. It was the mothers who walked for days throughout minefields to smuggle satellite images of mass graves out of the region. And by mid-2021, Tigrayan civil society has already compiled hundreds and thousands of evidences from videos, audios, satellite imagery, hospital logs, independent reports, and submitted them directly to places such as the International Criminal Court. Yet cases are still pending. Cases are still stuck in the matrix. And this is a warfare by other means. And when we have the Pretoria Agreement, which was signed in November 2022, and none of the civil society actors, none of those that are in this meeting, none of those that are working across the world for Tigray and other regions were in the room. This agreement contains no accountability mechanism, no vetting provision, or independent monitoring. Starvation has continued, sexual violence has continued, impunity has been rife, and ceasefire breaches have continued to go unpunished. But Tigrayan civil society did not stop. They've continued to document every hospital bombed after the cessation of hostilities, every convoy looted, every mass grave filled. They've built parallel evidence files that track the African Union transitional justice processes, which has been repeatedly delayed and defanged. They've continued to push for universal jurisdiction cases, as we now see in Germany, which we'll go on to in a moment. This is the only model, I would say, that works. Never trust a single political track. It always ends up dead. And I know that's an ironic word to use, but civil even litigation against corporate entities who've continued to supply surveillance technology and dual use goods to the Ethiopian regime have continued to be gone after, yet they continue to perpetrate atrocities. Every major donor, the EU, US, UK, Canada, Germany, must shift from at least 50% of their atrocity prevention funding directly to survivor-led organisations. Otherwise, this won't help anybody. Every universal jurisdiction investigation must have a survivor-centred co-investigator with veto power over disclosing positions and decisions. Every sanction package must be co-drafted with the affected diaspora group. Milak, please just tell me when I've gone over, because I'll just keep talking otherwise. To go back to the Germany case, in March 2025, a complaint was filed by League in Action Worldwide, an incredible organisation that works with civil society groups and with communities to gain actual tangible justice. On behalf of Tigrayan survivors, the complaint itself targeted 12 senior Ethiopian and Eritrean government and military officials, and requested the federal prosecutor to open an investigation under the principle of universal jurisdiction. We know that many countries have this tool but refuse to use it, and this is one of the core tools which should be used to go after the Ethiopian and the Eritrean officials that are continuing to be complicit in this genocide and continue to perpetrate it ultimately as well. But currently with this case, the Federal Prosecutor's Office has confirmed it's received the complaint, but it is now up to the prosecutor to decide whether to initiate a formal investigation. Now, the issue here is that in Germany, the law prohibits trials in absentia, which means a suspect will have to be in German custody for prosecutions to occur. This is always hard to do. And again, it is no justice to have in absentia trials, but what would it give to have civil society have their voice heard? That's the core problem with that. One of the main issues with all of this is because we keep treating survivors as victims and we keep bringing them into the mix as victims to be consulted on what they've been through, we will continue to provide the same failed outcomes. So that's my first main point. We have to include an act on civil society. Secondly, is that documentation must be used in a way that is not just about preserving memory for exhibitions, museums, etc. It must create prosecutable evidence while perpetrators still think they control the narrative. In Tigray, we know that civil society has developed standardized trauma-informed documentation protocols that have been shared with other activists and other places. These include chain of custody preservations, encrypted distribution storage using blockchain, secure transfer of across multiple jurisdictions, psychosocial support embedded in trauma teams. But we need this to be universal. The ICC backlog, to go back to that, is an absolute moral scandal. It's 20 years since the first conviction for Darfur, and there are also convictions going on now. But again, we see genocide reoccurring in Sudan, and the atrocities are on the rise again there. Yet the international community has stopped looking. And so we must fix this parallel justice architecture where this hierarchy of where justice is used. And a few ways we can do that are through hybrid tribunals, people's tribunals, such as we've seen. I've been at a few recently in Madrid with the Afghanistan tribunal. We've seen the Iran tribunals, and these must create evidentiary records that will later become prosecutable when political windows open. And if we don't do that, this happened in the Russell Tribunal, obviously the canonical People's Tribunal, but it also happened in the tribunals of Vietnam and East Timor. The third point I'll make, I'm trying to go a little bit quickly, Melat, I'm sorry for taking so much time, is early warning must become early action, or it's complicity that we then fall into a chain of. We can now predict genocide. We can do that with a high level of accuracy. We've got political statements. We have the intent. We have virtual imagery. We have satellite imagery to take photos and video evidence. We can see the dehumanizing hate speech on state television. We can see the weaponization of religious identity. We can see the discriminatory laws and policies. We can see arms inflows, military mobilization, and we can see communications blackouts. All these things are things we can act on. These are the things, at least 12 of these 14 risk factors of the atrocity crimes, of the UN's own framework on analysis of atrocity crimes, are flashing red when it comes to Tigray. Some of those I've just mentioned above. The UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide has also issued public warnings. The response has been silence. Then genocide began, and then the genocide has continued. We've ended up with mechanisms that we can't trigger. We've ended up with bypassing Security Council resolutions, and when these mechanisms are bypassed, it means that there is absolute lack of political will to do anything. There is lack of will, and it's left to people on the ground to pick up the pieces and to console those in communities that change is possible and change is coming, and to continue to console people. This is not good enough. Again, another thing that I'll lastly mention is hate speech. Hate speech, we've seen that with Abiy Ahmed calling Tigrayans cancer or daylight hyenas, when Amhara militias have called them junta remnants to be exterminated. This is not rhetoric. This is rhetoric this is rhetoric, but it's rhetoric before action. This is command language. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in a number of cases established that hate speech directed and publicly incited genocide itself is an act of genocide under Article 3C of the Convention. Yet Facebook's own 2021 internal audit showed it failed to remove 94% of reported incitement that was published in Amharic. So we need a new global hate speech eradication protocol with teeth that can act on these early warning and can make social media companies act. I have many more points, Malak, but I will leave it there and I'll speak again shortly probably, but I'll leave it there because I know probably people are zoning out of me.
No, definitely not. That was very interesting, I think, for all of us to hear. And it's always good to kind of have an understanding of the mechanisms within international law that can be pursued, and to keep in mind, like you mentioned, that it's not a linear kind of path. I think you highlighted that very well. And kind of gave us an idea of all the different mechanisms that can actually be utilized, and how they should be utilized in correspondence with each other rather than segregating them and trying to just pursue one path. So thank you for that. I think we can go to Joanne. Joanne, if you're ready, we can talk about. I know a lot of your work kind of builds solidarity with other communities who have faced similar atrocities and genocide, and you have managed to build that solidarity, but also kind of used what these victims have gone through to kind of create a movement in which all of the victims are able to kind of speak in one voice. So we can talk about how justice could be pursued outside of these international mechanisms, and how is storytelling also a part of that.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you a lot. I I was hoping to go last because I think what I'm going to say is kind of very different than what Sarah and James are talking about. They are the legal experts. I am not the legal expert, but I have found that over the years, working with these different victim communities now, I've learned a lot. And also, just being invested myself in, of course, everything that's happened in Tigray. I don't know if everybody knows, but I am actually 25% Tigrayan. My grandmother used to live in Adigrat. So I have visited Tigray and all over Ethiopia many times. I don't just come at this, I guess, as a someone invested in protection of human rights, although I have been, before and since. But somebody who and I'm like and I've always wanted to participate in the movement to address genocide. I just didn't know it would be so personal and close to home at this time of life. So I think I want to begin by acknowledging the reality that everyone in Tigray and everyone in the diaspora is living with, which is this is not a moment where suffering is behind us. This is not a time where we look back from a distance. The harm has been real. And I think for many, it continues. It's in different forms. And I believe the vast majority of us might believe that like a total political reset with fresh faces and leadership and real accountability is overdue. But it's probably it's likely essential for long-term justice and stability. But we also know something else, that Tigray can't wait. Tigray can't wait for justice systems to start working before asking what can we do like right now. And I want to talk about justice in the gaps, the forms of justice that communities around the world have built when formal systems collapse or delay, or they simply totally refuse to respond. These are the forms of justice that survivors create when the world abandons them, or it feels like they abandoned them. And these forms of justice are not consolation. They are not symbolic. They are not less than legal justice. They're actually the foundations that make future legal justice possible. I thought I would talk a bit about the concept of justice, highlight why institutions fail, speak about what I've learned from survivors, and what they do before institutions act, and then make a couple of quick notes and suggestions. And then you can draw your own conclusions from the stories that I tell. I'll take a long time, but I just wanted to cover some of the things I've learned. It's clear that when states fail, survivors lead. And when survivors lead, justice actually does become possible. And I think just understanding what justice actually is, looking at it, most people, I think, imagine justice as courts, trials, verdicts, punishment. But legal justice is actually just one portion of what true justice requires. There's something, transitional justice, which is a way, really it's just a way that communities respond to serious past abuses so that they can find truth and accountability and healing and hopefully reconciliation. the process and mechanisms sort of that societies use. We know that transitional justice has 6 dimensions. Retributive justice, which is punishment for perpetrators. Restorative justice, which is repairing relationships and community. Transformative justice, which is changing the systems that caused the harm. Preventative justice, which is ensuring the violence can't happen again. Epistemic justice, which is restoring the voice and credibility of survivors. And distributive justice, which is repairing injustice and resources and land and opportunity and power. I thought I would just touch on topics and ideas that fit in the different categories, not going through them all or anything, but things I've learned from the Alliance and working with different communities for a few years now. If we only wait for retributive justice, which is the courts, we lose decades of possibility. Every other form of justice begins long before institutions actually arrive and legal justice starts. And legal justice actually alone is never enough. Studies confirm that legal mechanisms can't meet all the victims' needs. Victims consistently desire acknowledgement, memory, reform, apology, guarantees of non-recurrence, reparations, truth, safety, dignity. And truth belongs to survivors. So there are things that survivors know that institutions just don't know. And we call this survivor epistemology. There's a professor and anthropologist, Vina Das. I'm just going to read her quote. She says, violence enters the world through institutions, but it is the everyday, it is in the everyday where recovery is forged. I think this is a profound truth that institutions, governments, armies, political parties, they're often the source of trauma. So it can't be institutions alone that lead communities out of the trauma. It's everyday people. It's neighbors and families and diaspora networks and survivors themselves who do it. Peace scholar John Paul Ladark writes, durable peace cannot be built by political elites alone. It requires the moral imagination of ordinary people. And I think that quote shifts the center of justice away from just formal institutions and towards survivors and communities. And I think this is why justice in the gaps is not charity, it's not keeping busy, it's not survival mode. It's actually the real work of rebuilding a people in the aftermath of some atrocity. So what does this mean for Tigray? I would say it means survivors know truth before institutions do. And survivors define justice before courts do. Survivors build the future before politicians do. And this is really not inspirational, it's like empirical. It's how genocide survivor communities have rebuilt themselves everywhere. And actually, yeah. So let me just stop for 1 second and say, talk about why legal justice fails. Although, James and Sarah could probably do a better job of this, but I think we should just talk about the truth openly, that international courts are slow, not because evidence is weak. They're slow because powerful nations decide what deserves attention. Denial is politically convenient for some states. Regional alliances override moral responsibility. Economic partnerships suppress acknowledgement. The UN Security Council is structurally designed to fail in the face of atrocity. And Ethiopia's geopolitical value has shielded perpetrators so far. I think African geopolitics punishes honesty and it actually rewards silence. So this is the political economy of justice. It's not about the truth. It's not about law. It's about power. And that is why Tigray can't wait. Not because Tigray does not deserve formal justice. It does, but because formal justice is constrained by these political incentives. So, having said that, I think there's perhaps one of the most important insights I've gathered from global survivor history is that it's actually communities that save themselves first, and institutions recognize it later. Um, so if we look at things like truth-telling, and we look at, I wanted to talk about the Rohingya community. So now actually at the Alliance, we have 8 communities that are together. We just welcomed the Yazidi community and the Rohingya community this summer. And I'm learning a lot about their communities' experiences. There's a nonprofit organization called Fortify Rights, and just want to talk about the Rohingya Documenters Network. So the Rohingya trained one another basically to safely record crimes. They showed what's possible even without internet, without safety, without citizenship, without international protection. They gave the world proof, and I think Tigray is doing that in many ways too. And it's not because you have to do all of this, but you already know more than any external investigator ever will, and you can share your stories. So in Cox's Bazar, which is the largest refugee camp actually in the world, it's like just under 1 million Rohingya live in one refugee camp, Cox's Bazar. The documentation that they gathered became actually some of the most trusted evidence in global genocide, in the global genocide case. Evidence from the 40 Rights Project and the Rohingya who actually collected that evidence was used in the referral to the ICJ. It was used to write comprehensive reports. It was used in legal analysis, and there's universal jurisdiction cases, and they've all cited their work. We need to be careful. We need to have training when collecting evidence. I know the Tigray Commission has done a lot of work on this, but it would be good if there's other efforts. I would not just rely on one body's work. It's good to have collection going on in a responsible way. When the world dismissed the Rohingya's suffering, they documented it themselves. And they actually gathered more than 10,000 testimonies before international investigators got there. So they built protection networks. They also preserved language and culture in refugee camps. They mapped destroyed villages from their memory. And today the ICC, the ICJ rely on that evidence. And the importance of narrative and telling our stories, I think, is like something to really underscore. I also learned something here from the Rohingya community, actually even the community here in Toronto in Canada. There was an I Am Rohingya youth documentation theater project. This was youth telling their own genocide stories on stage. It was created by Rohingya teenagers here, and they got like a $500 grant, something really small. They, instead of getting, they had a youth meeting they would regularly go to, and at the meeting they decided they were going to write a play together. They collected testimony, they turned it into a script, they performed it here, it got picked up by the national radio, and it sold out. And because it got picked up by the national radio, and it was called I Am Rohingya, to talk about being Rohingya, it educated thousands here. It preserved memory, it empowered the youth. And I think it was a really powerful example of post-memory activism, which is how youth actually become guardians of truth. And I think, later today, here in Toronto, there's a film showing that's from Tigray about sexual and gender-based violence. And it's a creative story. I think it's so important for us to keep doing that in every way that we can think possible. When we're talking about, there's actually a lot of studies. There's 2 institutions here just in Canada who are studying how when we use the creative arts to talk about our stories, we connect with people in a way that you can't just through a report. You can't just through a verdict at a court. But actually by telling your stories and finding ways to do that through art, through film, through theater, it's incredibly powerful. Actually, that I Am Rohingya theater, the play, they actually ended up creating a documentary about that, someone in the UK. And so there's a documentary that then went and toured internationally. So not only was there the play, there's the documentary about the play. And in both cases, the amount of awareness, that something like that can raise is enormous. And the connection with the protagonists, right, in these stories where you have emotional connections really quickly. Books are great too, but plays, films, things like that, a piece of art, people can absorb it in such a shorter amount of time. and they become connected with those that they're learning about. So, and I would just say with that, I think it's so important that we, whatever it is that we're producing, we subtitle in English, whether we like it or not. I cannot emphasize this enough. This is the language that the world is speaking. And if you only do it, if you only create products for Tigray or for those who speak Tigrinya, you're not connecting with the world. And so I would really encourage that as a high priority. It's not that it's trying to expand the audience to other speakers. And here's another interesting just story about preserving culture. Actually, the Tibetan community. You think of somebody, the Tibetan. Tibet had a genocide like in the 1960s, but they've never really been able to recover it. They're like dominated by China constantly, and there's still an erasure of their culture. Especially they have, with their kids, the kids are now going to residential schools, kind of like we did in the United States and Canada. They're really trying to sort of strip them of their Tibetan identity. And you can't even access Tibet if you're trying to do anything to help preserve the culture. So an interesting thing the community has started doing is teaching through YouTube their own culture. So they've taken to there's traditional Tibetan instruments, musical instruments that elders that have left Tibet, have escaped Tibet essentially, are teaching through YouTube videos how you play certain instruments, how you play certain songs, traditional songs, and actually connecting with kids who are able to get that programming inside of Tibet. And then in Tibet, they're keeping that alive. So you think about like when you don't even have access, in some ways, what else creatively can we do? And I think the act of remembering is really important. Being sure to remember, we're marking the Aksum genocide, we're marking the Mariam Dengalat massacre. The other dates are really important. Building monuments, even when it's complicated. The Tamil community, something I learned with them. Sri Lanka has repeatedly banned or restricted memorial events for Tamil civilians. The Tamil community had constructed a memorial. I think it was in either 2018 or 2019. And that was taken down by the government in 2021. So what they invested in was torn down. The largest Tamil diaspora in the world is actually here in Ontario. And in Brampton, just this year, they set up a memorial to the genocide, calling it a genocide. And no one is going to take down this memorial because the city council here approved it. So you think of like the Tigrayan diaspora could do something like that, especially in places where Tigrayans are highly concentrated. Like you think of like Denver and other places like it. So how do you creatively keep the memory alive, essentially, and create spaces for us to do that? Being heard is justice. Trauma scholars confirm this. Judith Herman, she's a prominent psychiatrist and author, renowned for her work on trauma and recovery. She says, recovery begins when the survivor tells the story. And Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps the Score, says, healing is the reclaiming of voice. To be heard is one of the deepest needs of victims. And truth commissions actually show that also. Acknowledgement is actually often valued as much as punishment. So Argentina's National Commission, Chile's National Commission, the truth telling and being heard was so valuable in those commissions. So important, it was seen as partial justice. A really good case is the renowned South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they suggest that victims actually prioritize the truth and acknowledgement of what happened over the simple demand for criminal prosecution, especially in contexts where widespread prosecution is not feasible. So while punishment addresses the perpetrator, acknowledgement actually addresses the victim's need and for their reality to be validated publicly. So when clergy wrote names, as James was talking about, or you see the collage of victims' photos, or health workers keeping lists, and diaspora documenting digital evidence or voice notes, that's actually all a part of justice. And we can also be creative and think of ways to validate experiences and let people tell their stories. We can think of creative ways to do that internationally too. When we do, those are acts of justice. We don't need to wait for governments or institutions or even commissions to do this. How do we create space for people to tell their stories and to be heard? And a great example that I've learned is from the Tutsi community. So at the Alliance of Genocide Victim Communities, like I said, we had the 8 communities. One of the key learnings that the Tigray community in Toronto is learning, also from the Tutsi community that's here, is around this and the power of listening. So April to July every year, in Rwanda and in Tutsi communities around the world, Tutsi people gather together in homes, churches, in the field somewhere, at all sorts of different times of day, and they talk about the genocide and what happened and what their experiences were. And from my understanding, it's like, some people can't, of course, people are working or whatever, or they're at school. So there's just multiple occasions almost every week, especially in Rwanda, here scattered throughout that season, because the genocide there happened between April and July. So April, July, every single year, people get together in groups and they just talk about the genocide. They talk about what happened to them. They talk about whatever they want to say. And the deal is that when they get together in these groups, sometimes it's large groups, sometimes it's small groups, you don't leave until every person has had the opportunity to say whatever they wanted to say. And so that means when I talk to the Tutsi community here, that sometimes they go to somebody's house because it's being held at a home for dinner, and they don't leave until 3 a.m. in the morning. But they all agree that that's what they're going to do. They're going to get together, they're going to talk, and they let everyone speak until they're done. And it's remarkable, the healing that's come from that. And the way just being able to express, they talk about the fact that when they do this in large gatherings in Rwanda, they have mental health professionals that stand off to the side, because just talking about it can cause flashbacks for people, and they can go into different states. And if you know anything about the genocide in Rwanda, it was done primarily through knives. So there's a lot of a million people died in a short amount of time. So the violence that happened in a short amount of time, it's incredibly traumatizing people. But they still do this. This is their choice. And if somebody has a flashback and goes into a bad state, they just take them off to the side, calm them down. If they want to come back, they can. If not, they're excused essentially, and they continue. It's a commitment to each other. It takes no other institution, no other person. It just takes the victims themselves coming together and saying, let's talk about it with each other. So I think that's a really powerful example. I think, what else did I want to say? And I guess before I kind of wrap up here, I'll just say, again, just these quick, maybe, I don't know, I'll say I'm addressing some misconceptions about justice, as I kind of started at the beginning, but there's a myth that justice begins with courts. And I want to say that courts are the last, slowest stage. Communities are first. There's a myth that documentation can wait and it comes later. Documentation is like a survival act, and we need to do it now. There's a myth that healing comes after political change. Healing begins immediately, or trauma deepens. We imagine that when justice arrives, when leaders change, when institutions acknowledge the truth, then we will finally be able to mend. But the evidence from every genocide-affected community tells a different story. Healing begins in the first moments after the violence ends, even while it's still ongoing. And when trauma is left unspoken, when grief is buried intentionally, when families sit alone with their pains, the wound doesn't stay still, it actually grows and it spreads into the next generation. And there's studies from Rwanda and Cambodia that demonstrate that if survivors receive early forms of social support, even small support, this is like, it'll protect people long term. So, and when I mean like small support, it's a morning circle, like we're talking about, a safe conversation, a prayer gathering, a shared meal, a supportive neighbor. You begin to stitch the social fabric back together, and they experience better long-term psychological outcomes compared to those who remain isolated. So we wait for political change to begin healing. It's like, I don't know. It's like, what are they? It's like waiting for rain during a drought. The community dries out and the roots weaken. But when healing begins early, even in tiny forms, people regain their strength, their dignity, their connection to one another. Political change may one day support that healing, but it will not start it. Only communities can do that. And Tigrayans at home and in the diaspora have already shown that, I think, when healing begins, where survivors choose to reach out for one another, there are good things that happen. You don't need to suffer alone. One more myth, that youth will understand when they're older, or that youth are somehow, can be excluded at this time. And I just wanted to say that we know that youth are actually the carriers of post-memory, and they need to be engaged right now. The next generation inherits the emotional weight, the cultural memory, and the identity formation that's shaped by the events that they did not personally experience. So there's the idea that somehow our children will understand when they're older, like we say this to protect them or to shield them from pain that we don't want them to have. But research in psychology and memory studies shows something very different. Young people inherit the emotional weight of events. They notice the silence at home. They feel the grief in the air. They see the photos that are no longer on the wall. They grow up in the space that's left behind by those who disappeared. And scholars call that post-memory. It means that youth are already carrying the story, even when adults do not speak it out loud. So this is why I think it's so essential to involve them now and not later. And when youth are given truth and context and language and culture and community and a role in justice work, they become these confident carriers of memory, and they become protectors of identity, and they become builders of the future. And when they're left out, or they're told, you'll understand later, they carry confusion and silence and an emotional heaviness, and there's no guidance. And it's really, we see this across our communities in the Alliance. There's a problem with youth in all of our communities, and it's partly because of this idea that we don't talk about it, we just move past it. We're not trying to address it, and this is what's happening with them. So, and then we see that if you have youth preserving the truth when you include them, they actually will help with the preserving of the truth when institutions fail. So the Rohingya that I talked about earlier, with the youth performing theater based on testimony, that's because they were included. The Armenian community does some similar things. There's indigenous youth that are reviving language. The Uyghur community built digital archives. I didn't talk about them, and I'm not going to keep talking because Sarah's here. We should move on to somebody else. But the Uyghur community has done an amazing job where they actually have an online platform where you can just self-identify who it is that's been detained, essentially, and when they went missing, and all of this. And there's I forget how many thousands of cases that you can just sort of research online now through their efforts. So engage youth, essentially. And then let me just offer this one analogy that I really like. I heard somebody say, formal justice is like a cathedral, and it takes many years to build. And but communities kind of build this shelter first. Shelter comes first. The cathedral will come later. Across every genocide, communities act first. Institutions follow decades later, if they follow at all. Every genocide shows the same pattern. In Rwanda, the local courts had like 1.9 million cases. The ICTR had 93 cases. The community came first. And if you look at the Armenian genocide, the diaspora really kept the memory and the truth alive for 100 years. Institutions recognized later. Just last year in Canada, we recognized it as a genocide. But the diaspora memory, the community memory, outlived a century of denial. The recognition is going to come sooner or later for Tigray, but it's the community that will keep it alive. If you look at Indigenous truth work here in Canada, it's the elders who preserve truth long before official apologies. Commissions, apologies, they all came later. In Canada, we're still processing court cases 150 years later. So this is the beginning of justice. Justice in the gaps is not a lesser justice. How we live, it's how we live, it's how we recover, it's how we protect each other and we rise again. It's how Tigray refuses to disappear. It's how Tigray will prevail. Violence can shatter relationships, justice rebuilds them. We can control our narrative. We can control our own narrative. It's a sovereignty. And the future begins before political change. The future is built by those who refuse to wait for permission. And when we begin justice, we are already and will continue to if we think about how others have done it, sometimes doing this little bit of research and trying out these practices and creating spaces for others to engage with them, I think, we really can achieve the healing it is that we're all looking for. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I am not going to attempt to kind of summarize what you said because I feel like you've mentioned so many things I would not do it justice. But thank you so much. That was great. And I would actually argue you wouldn't be too far off from a lot of the things that James mentioned. I don't think you're that far apart as you think.
I was just going to say, Milat, if I can just say, Joanne, you filled the gaps in my legal bore of actually how communities and what communities can do. And I think I just want to say this, just one sentence, which is if anybody wants to connect the dots between truth, justice, and actual reconciliation, then you should do a hell of a lot more to listen to Joanne and what Joanne says, because Joanne speaks a lot of sense on how you can actually galvanize justice in your own way.
Essentially, that what I was saying is basically what Joanne mentioned is the foundation of where justice begins. And I think, James, what you were mentioning would basically be some of the steps that would come after that, meaning they'll definitely be able to be integrated and reconciled. They would not be something that's separate from each other anyway. So thank you so much, Joanne. I think it's very important, especially the mention of how pain is inherited. That's something that's very close to my heart because I'm very passionate about how the new generation of Tigrayans are being affected by not just what we went through, but the way that this has kind of progressed in the last 30 years, the kind of escalation of being marginalized and being kind of being segregated from the Ethiopian community as a whole, and how this has been a build-up rather than something that just happened in Tigray overnight. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's a progressive thing that's happened and it's not an overnight thing. And I think this is a good point to bring in Sarah. I think when we were speaking about how, Joanne, you mentioned how documentation and healing and political change is not something, healing and documentation can happen throughout when these things are actually occurring, and how political change is not something that survivors should wait for them to engage in pursuing justice. And I think, Sarah, you can speak more to this about how justice and accountability can actually be pursued in environments where there's a lot of uncertainty, political instability, where we're very unsure what tomorrow brings. and we're unsure of what it means to actually pursue justice, especially for survivors. And maybe the environment may not be conducive for survivors to actually take the lead in this. So I think the context in the diaspora and within Tigray may be slightly different, but maybe can speak to both in how survivors can actually do this.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. And I'm so sorry I came in 45 minutes late. I was out of town camping and got stuck in like the most horrible traffic. I was on the highway for hours. But anyway, I'm here now, and again, just apologies for all of that. I think, I also really appreciated what Joanne said, and that focus on what the community can do is so important, and the importance of starting like straight away, not waiting for institutions to catch up is incredibly important, because I agree 100% with Joanne, with James, that the community starts first and then institutions follow. And, likewise with other communities I've worked with, like, Joanne mentioned the Uyghur database. Well, the Uyghur community's efforts with that regard really supported all sorts of legal advocacy efforts. So like the evidence that they put together in that sense was used in court cases around the world. I used a lot of that evidence in a court case in Canada. So they're really they're mutually reinforcing spheres, and that's important for us to remember. So I actually want to keep my portion sort of high level, rather than getting too deeply into the weeds of legal mechanisms and confusing everybody, and then saving a lot of time for Q&A. And there's a couple mechanisms I want to focus on. The main one is the International Court of Justice, because this is one that is particularly relevant with this case, where we have very strong evidence of genocide, and we have one of the perpetrating states, being Ethiopia, being a state party to the Genocide Convention. So the ICJ, essentially the way the ICJ works is that it can adjudicate disputes between states only with consent, but certain treaties have basically, if states join that treaty, they give advanced consent to the ICJ adjudicating disputes. So the Genocide Convention within that has an article that says that if there are disputes, the state parties agree that the ICJ can resolve them. Ethiopia, as a state party to the convention, has agreed to that provision. And what that means in practice is that any other state party to the Genocide Convention can bring Ethiopia to court for genocide. One common misconception with the Genocide Convention here is that there needs to be very unequivocal evidence of genocide, state declarations to that effect. That's not true. In fact, a state party can be held responsible for failing to prevent genocide. They can be held responsible for failing to punish genocide. So I think there's a really strong case here for Ethiopia being guilty on a number of provisions, and any sympathetic state party can initiate that process. So that's something that I think this community can really explore. And again, I agree with Joanne, it starts with the community, and it starts with engaging in these meetings with relevant states that may be interested in initiating that sort of case, and documenting evidence to support those efforts. The International Criminal Court is another option that typically communities explore. Unfortunately, in this case, neither Eritrea nor Ethiopia is a party to the Rome Statute, so that's not an option. But the failure of the ICC to be an option opens up a discussion that's important to have about universal jurisdiction laws. So universal jurisdiction is the principle that domestic states anywhere in the world can prosecute perpetrators of atrocity crimes, even if there's no connection with that state and the perpetrator with the act. So what that means in practice in, say, Canada, is if an Ethiopian or Eritrean official that's responsible for atrocities against Tigrayans so much as steps foot on Canadian soil for like a weekend trip, he can in theory be prosecuted for genocide. This does require the government's involvement. It needs to be country like prosecutors engaging in this, but again, this is where community galvanization can be so critical. If the community organizations in the relevant countries that have these laws can put together the evidence, dossiers of documentation, communicate with the local prosecutors, even, looking at the social medias of perpetrators and seeing where they tend to travel, all of that can help. So rather than, waiting for the political will, this is something that community involvement can really support. The last thing I wanted to touch on is UN human rights bodies. And again, I know I'm sort of flying through this, but I want to keep it, I don't want to completely swarm you with information. But the UN human rights bodies can be a really useful tool as well to support all of these more typical legal efforts. So by that I mean communications to special rapporteurs, treaty bodies. There are treaty bodies at the United Nations level that monitors compliance with various treaties. They can engage in country visits. They can issue annual reports, and all of that can serve to put together a really strong, credible record that can then be used in cases like at the ICJ or for criminal prosecutions. So there's a whole list of things that can be done. All of these pathways can be supported by the community, and these shall be pursued essentially. So again, I know that was really quick, but I found that when I tend to speak for an hour about legal mechanisms, I start to glaze over. So I think I'll just leave it there and happy to answer any and all questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I think it's you all covered the different elements of mechanisms of justice, and I think they all kind of speak to each other. So without knowing it, you've kind of collaborated on this. But I think it'll be good to open it up to everyone who's here. I have my own like list of questions, but because I'm trying to be generous, I'll open it up to everyone else. If anyone has questions, please, if the host can help me out on this, if people could raise their hands and maybe depending on the question and how kind of difficult or meaty it is, then we can see if we could just do it one by one, or maybe we can collect a couple and go ahead. So if anyone has questions, please raise your hand. Or also you could type it in the chat. Joanne has a question.
I do, because these are the legal experts, James and Sarah. My question is about you. Actually, Sarah, you mentioned special rapporteurs, and I feel like in my knowledge, that's an area that, to my knowledge of what the Tigray advocacy, and that's not comprehensive, but I don't know that that's been explored very much. And I'm wondering, like in the sense of, I know there's a special rapporteur around torture, and there's different. What would the best way be to approach special rapporteurs? Can anybody do that from the diaspora? Is it better to go through an organization? Do you need to be closer to where they meet people? Do you need to go meet them in person? Like, what is the process of kind of getting their attention?
Need for any of those questions? No. Would it be helpful? Absolutely. So, when I recently did a submission for clients on to the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, I followed up with an email, and then I actually tracked her down and met her at a conference where I knew she was going to be at, like a little stalker. And we had a little ad hoc meeting in the hallway. And then I kept emailing her. And we have a nice rapport. So that relationship always will help. It doesn't need to be a community level, but I think again it would probably be helpful to show that the communication is coming from an organized group rather than just one person. But also you can do both, right? Individuals can write and a community organization can write and just flood their inboxes, bother them. I hope you're not posting this online. But essentially, I mean, that's what I would suggest. And then in terms of which special rapporteurs, there's a list, I believe, on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where it lists out all the mandates, and there are several that can be applicable. There's torture, there's arbitrary detention. I mean, there's a whole host of them. So I think all of them can be pursued. And also, I would encourage anyone who does this to look at the terms, like who the actual special rapporteur is now and how long their term is set to last. Because if you build up a relationship with one, but their term's expiring in 3 months, maybe that's not worth the effort if there's only, finite resources available. I don't know, James, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I will just quickly come in on that. I've worked with, again, many different special rapporteurs on Myanmar, on Afghanistan, on torture as well. And to be honest, a lot of special rapporteurs, they are academics, they are practitioners, they're experts in their field, but they thrive off of what civil society can give to them, or how civil society can back them. So yeah, absolutely get in touch. You get individuals can get in touch. Civil society groups can get in touch. Coalitions are good as well. You can write letters. You can write statements. You can, you can get them. We've had them brief Parliament here in the UK. Different special rapporteurs. I'm not going to mention any particularly, but they are great for bridging that gap between civil society and a lot of the Human Rights Council delegations, a lot of the diplomats, and also getting towards governments as well. And we're meeting with FORB envoys, freedom of religion and belief envoys as well. Special rapporteurs are great for all of that. So yeah, I think go for it. Just like and as Sarah says, just plow their inboxes with communications, and they will get back to you.
Great. I think that was a very important question. Yeah. So they support in bridging that gap. I think that's the key takeaway. And also hunting them down at conferences could also be helpful. If we can go to, I think, Shemedlis, you had your hand up first. So if we can unmute Shemedlis.
Hello. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I want to thank first for all the presenters. To be honest, all the presentation themselves can be like a one-day webinar or a session, so to say. I was listening to Janice's presentation, and I was even thinking that I was listening to a book already like published, so to say. So it's interesting that involving different expertise is essential, and taking the experiences of other countries is essential. And my question would be in terms of justice. I know you have said that priority is always given or has to be given to the community, but at the same time, politicians, leaders in time of war had or have a role in the process, be it in perpetrating and be it in settling as well. So in the context of Tigray, in the context of Ethiopia, right now what we are observing is, what hurts me most is those who used to lead the anti aggression, the anti-war process, are now part of the perpetrators of the genocide, and partly we see a kind of denial, and those processes one affects the people emotionally, and at the same time it might, or it will have, as you experts would say, might have an impact on the process of looking for justice and accountability. What's your view on that, and what could the role of experts, the law itself, and the community would be in this regard, is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, any one of you three can take that question.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think it was breaking up slightly for me. I don't know if it was somebody else. I live in the middle of nowhere, so it's probably my internet. But I think one thing I'll say is the law is a fool, to put it blankly. And the law is great in many respects. It provides a set of guiding principles for how things should be done. But actually, in practice, the law never works how we want it to. And the law is never perfect. And in terms of going after justice and accountability, actual tangible justice and accountability, and by that I mean things like trials and people being locked up and people being held actually accountable and impunity ending for people's crimes, is something that we see less and less. And so survivor-centered accountability, and led by organizations that can get, either it be statements from foreign off ministries, whether it can be from international governments, whether it can be diplomatic missions, whether it be statements at the United Nations. It is difficult to underestimate the power of that in getting justice, because the canonical forms of justice, the lofty heights of trials, just don't seem to be something that happen. They justice is not served in the ways that we see domestic justice being served, and even domestic justice is now served after lengthy time periods have passed where people then don't get the justice they feel they needed at the time. And so we have to put so much more emphasis on people being heard and people being seen and people being acknowledged. And as Joanne said in many of her remarks, this comes from civil society mobilizing. I know that probably doesn't quite answer your question, but I think we have to be open to many other forms of justice.
If I can maybe add something to that, I think I agree with you, James, but it's also a matter of justice doesn't happen on its own, which is really unfortunate and really actually truly unfair that then a lot of the burden falls to community members to push for the justice that should just happen and should just serve them. But that is unfortunately what we see. I mean, we don't see universal jurisdiction prosecutions happen just because it's the right thing to do. So the, public prosecutors do it. We don't see ICC cases or ICJ cases start without massive advocacy. So that's part of it, right? I think as a community, this community holds so much agency in terms of which mechanism to push for and so much responsibility. And I know it's not what anyone here asked for or wanted, but there is some power in that, right? And choosing which pathway you end up wanting to pursue and how much energy you want to put into that advocacy and where. So there's different sides to that.
Thank you both.
Sorry, Malak, just to jump in on the case that I mentioned in my remarks on the current case in Germany, the Tigrayan case, where I said that the Federal Prosecutor's Office has confirmed it's received the testimony, but it hasn't decided whether to formally open an investigation. This is a core part of basically what Sarah's just said there, where German law prohibits in absentia trials, therefore the perpetrator would need to be in German custody. This is unlikely to happen. And so these cases of universal jurisdiction, although they are great in terms of the ability to take prosecutions in countries which are signed up to the concept of universal jurisdiction and are willing to exercise it, it then gets messed up in the melee of domestic law, international law, what states have the ability to do, and then it becomes quite futile and empty. So we have to be so open to so many different other ways of getting what we'd like to call sort of a holistic justice. That's
true. And actually, if I could jump in one more time, that makes me think that I want to mention another mechanism I didn't talk about in my remarks, which is targeted sanctions, because this is something that doesn't rely on a perpetrator being present. Mind you, in Argentina, they could start an investigation if no perpetrator is present under their universal jurisdiction framework. So there are options, and I recognize now I'm jumping around a little, but back to targeted sanctions. This is another less traditional, let's say, avenue of justice in the sense that, again, it's not trials or putting someone in prison. But if some of the perpetrators are added to a sanctions list in whether it's Canada, the UK, both the US, then those individuals would be denied entry if they try to visit. Any assets they have in the country would be seized. In Canada, I don't know where the UK is in respect to this, but any assets can actually be repurposed, as in seized, sold, and the proceeds used to compensate victims. In theory, it has to follow a quite lengthy federal court process, and it's a new-ish area of law. But there are other options here as well. Options that aren't necessarily the typical court-based justice routes, but could provide some impact. And in a sense, if you're, choosing between an investigation being launched in name only, but no one ever being arrested, or potentially assets being seized, maybe the latter is more impactful.
So I think that's a very, very important and vital message. I think, Shemedlis, I hope you got that. I think they mentioned 4 things: survivor-led accountability, how important that is, and how maybe the leadership doesn't really have to fill in those gaps when survivors that can do it themselves. And empowering those survivors is essentially part of like the foundation, as Joanne mentioned, and I think James kind of emphasize that point. And also justice doesn't happen on its own. So it's up to those survivors, unfortunately, to push for that accountability. And although leadership is important, it also kind of can be a bit futile and certain, like you mentioned, Shamadlis, and also be open to different forms of justice, and also that court-led kind of justice may not be the right lane at this given time, and we can also pursue things like targeted sanctions, but also understanding the capacity that these CSOs and survivors have in order to pursue different means. So thank you for that. I think that's a very good takeaway. I hope everyone has got that. Batseba, I think, but Danny or Batseba, I don't know who was first, but
I think this was a very informative session, very inspiring, and amazing session overall. And one is to James and to Sarah. So Sarah, thank you for raising the issue on UN rapporteurs. So there are open calls for submission by the UN rapporteurs. What do you think of submitting those? Because we submitted a compilation from September to December, or sorry, September to November on those. And how impactful do you think this would be specifically when specific submission calls for submissions come out? And secondly, to Joanne, you know the Tigray community very well, and how do you think we could implement the various forms of justice that you raised? Like, can you give us specific examples from other communities and how this can be done? I wish we can work together on this, but then maybe you can give us.
I missed my question. What was my question?
It was about the utility, the value in doing and responding to open calls for submissions by special rapporteurs.
Okay, yeah, you can go first, and I'll yeah.
Sure. I mean, I was just simply going to say yes, sure, valuable, of course. Just keep in mind that sometimes these open calls have like thematic constraints, like they're asking about a very specific thing. Sometimes they have very strict page limit counts. I remember doing one that was like 8 pages maximum, which is crazy short when you're trying to talk about some of these topics. So I wouldn't limit yourself to them, but yeah, of course, why not?
Yeah, that was quite what I was going to say. I don't. Yeah, I think they're good to do. Do them. Definitely do them. Get your organisation submitting, and submit to as many as you can, and as many as you have the evidence to do so, because they will inform best practice. They will inform guidelines. They will inform how the multilateral system, the UN system, then deals with the submission of victim-led organisations' information of justice efforts on the ground as well, and they also will inform how special rapporteurs then use that information when it comes to diplomatically. So they're always really good to do. We've done them for, as I've already mentioned Myanmar, but Afghanistan, Ukraine. On different rapporteurs' mandates on all sorts of conflicts, and that they're always good once you've got those, and when they're published as well, you'll be able to see them published as well, which is great in terms of being able to raise the awareness. So yeah, I would, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, Joe, thank you both. Joanne, if you could take the next question.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think with the Tigray community, I would say that, when the war happened, it was a surprise to many individuals, and I think that it was so traumatizing to so many in the diaspora that there was such a response of so many people put their lives on hold. People lost their jobs and marriages were ending, and all of this was happening. And I think that people pushed so hard to do something, especially before the Pretoria Agreement was signed, which kind of took, in some ways, the wind out of many people's sails. But we're pushing for 2 years to do whatever they possibly could that it's understandable that there's burnout and there's disillusionment, and I see a lot of burnout and disillusionment in the community, also politically what's happened in Ethiopia and in Tigray. And so I think I just wanted to say something about the burnout, which is that, you know, there's a trauma therapist that I was talking to about this, and I think their best description I heard was that when you reach burnout, that it's not something to moralize about. You know, it's not something you have to feel guilty about. It's kind of like you don't make somebody feel guilty when they break an arm, and they like your brain needs a break essentially, and it's understandable that the community needed a break, has needed a break, and that a lot of individuals just need to stop because of the incredible sacrifices that somebody made during those 2 years. At the same time, here we are a number of years later, and I think that moving forward, I think it's really important to think about what each individual is most interested in, because there are so many aspects, you know, of justice, accountability, healing that we were just talking about. And I think that, you know, what you're understanding what your own capacity is, not guilting yourself into doing it because you feel interested in it, because it's something that you are attracted to doing essentially, and you have the capacity to potentially take on, is really important. And then trying to find like-minded people to pursue that with, essentially. So if it's like, you know, you heard the special rapporteur idea and thought that was really great, I think that, you know, that would be really interesting, that's something that you can find a couple of other people to do it with, and just do it. You know, just go with what you've been inspired by, and to break out of this sense that you need a vast amount of resources and a huge number of experts and all of this in order to approach the UN. You don't. You know, can you get a couple of people together, an organization behind you, perhaps, and maybe one of these great lawyers that are here or somebody else to potentially advise you, and go? Yeah, you can, you know? And so I think that the sense that like, and it, you know, if you're living in Tigray right now, and that's not really for one reason or another something that you can accomplish, there's so many other things that you can do to heal and to provide justice. And like we were talking about, I think the example still of just getting together and telling each other your stories is remarkably beneficial to actually healing, and that healing will get you in the position to be able to pursue the justice, you know, to get out of the sense that, to break out of the sense that there's nothing that you can do. There is so much you can do, and actually by talking about it, you start on that path. And what else would I say? Just you know, there are other things that can be done that are strategic, but I think that you need a longer conversation around some alternative bigger ideas. I think it's, you know, just recognizing where you're at. So much of our lives are lived online now, and I think, you know, as much as we were all on Twitter for 2 years at least, retweeting and tweeting and things like that, I think continuing to dialogue online, those who are, you know, taking to places like TikTok and Facebook and are talking about these issues, I think it's really beneficial to keep raising awareness that way. And, you know, and trying to create products that are in English, whether we like it or not, as much as possible. Don't make the content just for each other. Make it for the others, because that's how we're going to continue to build a bigger movement towards justice.
Could I just jump in for 1 second and just say, the thing with justice is justice always galvanizes itself at times of conflict. Justice doesn't come when justice doesn't start to ferment when there is stasis. Justice and justice efforts from civil society groups, from communities that are in turmoil comes when conflict is ongoing. And we see, like, if I go back to my work on Afghanistan, being swept off my feet to go and work on Hazaras in Afghanistan, or on the evacuation of Afghans who worked for the US or the UK government, that was 2020. And then we see that these justice efforts sort of start to lose pace. They start to lose traction, and we saw that in the same time with the Tigray War. I saw it at the same time working on Armenia and Azerbaijan at the time when Nagorno-Karabakh was starting to be annexed and invaded. We've seen it with countless conflicts. The time when conflict is rife, people start to raise their voices. And the thing is that these are lengthy processes, and they don't stop when the media cycle changes. People's suffering doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling, and when celebrities stop speaking out, and when the UN moves on to another conflict. Again, with Ukraine, there is a thing called war fatigue, and it happens everywhere. The conflict starts to wane on, as you may say, and it's a challenge that we as civil society, and I class myself in that, me as a legal advocate around civil society, this is where we have to keep the momentum up with politicians, with diplomats, with lawyers, with mechanisms that can take action, because it's still going on. Just because the cameras stop focusing on it, just because the reports stop coming out in high detail, just because it's only civil society and the small man and woman who thinks that they can take on the world, they are the ones that at the end of the day are left sitting in silence with people who've moved on. And we have to realize that these things are a process, and we have to keep it up. And we have to know that regardless of what anybody else outside of the room thinks, those in the room, it matters too.
Yeah, I agree. If I could also jump in response. And I think the interesting thing about justice is, even as the war fatigue sets in and people aren't interested in the news anymore as much, justice actually, in a way, becomes more important and more relevant after the dust is settled, both for just logistically in terms of the length of a lot of these processes, but also in terms of the deterrence of them, right? Like, if perpetrators of genocide learn in the aftermath that they did the thing and nothing happened in consequence, then they're far more likely to do it again. And we've seen that with Tigray. This is not the first time there's been a genocide in Tigray. So I think that that lesson should really be heeded. And like I said earlier, with the Genocide Convention, it's, states can be held responsible not just for committing genocide, but for failing to punish genocide. That's an after the fact feature. So that's incredibly important. And now the other thing I wanted to raise, just because it occurred to me as Joanne was speaking, only slightly off topic, but if no one's talked to you guys about the app called Eyewitness, someone should. This is an app that's wonderful, that's used for documentation. I think when Joanne mentioned those of you in Tigray, that popped into my head that this is something that even folks on the ground can do, and maybe actually best place to do is take part in some of the documentation efforts. So I don't know if it's available on all platforms or just iPhone or what have you, but it's something to look into.
Thank you. Those are all very great responses. Thank you all. We have another question, I think. Alan?
Thank you, Mela. Thank you all. My question is, like, Tigray genocide is a repeated phenomena. Like experts say 4, 5, 6 times has happened to Tigray. Now, my question is, can independence prevent us from happening again? Are we far from asking justice if we ask for an independent state? Can independent state help the people of Tigray? Is there any experience from other parts of the world that helps victims being independent? That is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I could start if everyone's okay with that. So I'll start with the sort of basic principle of because the basic principle here is not independence at the outset, but self-determination, right? Self-determination is this idea that every people has a right to self-determination. Now, within self-determination, there's internal self-determination and external self-determination. Internal self-determination is like what we have, for example, in Canada with Quebec, where people can be well represented within a larger national structure. External self-determination is the idea that for whatever reason that's not possible, that's not feasible, and then that coalesces into a right to independence or independent statehood. What's interesting about the intersection of these topics is that when a people has gone through atrocities like the Tigrayans have gone through, and they've gone through genocide, it definitely strengthens the argument that the Tigrayan people have a right to not just self-determination or internal self-determination, but they have a right to external self-determination. They have a right to independence. So I think in my mind, that's where those two, sort of threads intertwine. In terms of if Tigray becomes independent, can that help other justice efforts? I'm not sure. And when it gets to that point, they may be too different and topically, but certainly there's that overlap in terms of making the case for it. That's really interesting. So, really good question.
The other thing on that point is that regarding Tigray and gaining self-determination is that every case where this is successful and this manages to happen sets some sort of precedent somewhere within it for how it can be done elsewhere. And it may not be a full precedent, but there may be things within the process, within the political process, the legal process, that can be applied to other situations, what may give them strength to be able to gain, whether it be independence that they want or whatever it may be that they want to gain from a situation through justice. But also it then means that but it also means for Tigrayans in the current situation that they can look at other situations and go, hey, look, they've just you haven't got any ideas actually on top of my head, but hey, look, they've just gained this form of justice through this, whether it be the ICJ ruling or whether it be a UN a UN procedure that's issued a statement, or whether it be some sort of diplomatic mission that said something. It may give you an avenue to go to them and say, hey, look, you said this applies to us, could you help us too? So there are many different ways that you can then take these rulings and take these things forward and apply them to your own narrative.
That's a really good point, and actually gives me another idea in terms of looking at precedents. James, you and I are we're such a great team. I mean, but anyway, it occurs to me that even if independence isn't achieved straight away, there may be all sorts of interim steps you can model after, say, the case of Palestine, right? Like the state of Palestine had a non-state observer status, or I forget the full term, but they had a voice at the United Nations for many years now. So that could be a useful tool as well, and that may be a good precedent for Tigrayans to look at and say, hey, as James said, hey, they did that. Why not us?
Can I also say that along those lines, you could do it not even at the UN, but in a particular country. So Tibet recently in Canada, I think it was just last year, there was it's a non-binding motion, but still there was it was unanimous. There was a non-binding motion passed that recognized the Tibetan people as a people and as a nation, which is really significant, and is, I don't know if it happened. I know there was also something that was potentially passing in the US. I'm just not up to date whether that actually passed, but I know the one in the US, if it was going to pass, what would then also, it's going to impact how Canada talks to China about Tibet, how the United States potentially talks to China about Tibet because of this recognition. So you can also just impact how Tigray is being treated in different nations that way.
Just another point on that as well, to just jump in. I'm sure Joanne will be aware of this, and Sarah as well. So on the 24th of November, the Monday the 24th of November, the Australian Parliament recognised, passed a private members motion recognising the persecution of Hazaras. It wouldn't recognise the genocide, and that's the same issue we've had with the UK government, is that genocide puts a duty to act and a duty to prevent on states. So states do not like the political dynamics of accepting a genocide determination unless it is widespread. This is something that so many states have then said, yeah, we will also agree to this. There is also so much, again, with Australia, the UK, Commonwealth countries, around the failure of them during the fall of Afghanistan. But they've noted, however, in the private members bill, that Hazaras are being persecuted. Their persecution is ongoing alongside other ethnic and religious minorities, as well as the persecution of women and and girls, and this amounts to inhumane violence and suffering. So this is huge, and these things, a bit like what Joanna's just said, these things are really big little steps, if that makes any sense, in recognizing persecution. And again, they should be lauded, and they should be congratulated for. But getting full determinations, getting governments to recognize genocide is a really big ask.
Can I just say something about that too? Getting governments, national governments, to recognize is really hard. But there's another strategy, and I don't think the Tigray community has particularly pursued, which is to actually get city councils to recognize genocide.
Yes.
Happened in the UK. Yeah, it's happened for the Hazara community. It's happened for, and it builds. Like if you get a city council to say it, and then you've got New Lines Institute, you've got these others that are saying it. You just can build the momentum in a really big way. Eventually, it's, and you combine that with really taking control of your narrative. Like I can remember with the genocide against the Tutsis with Rwanda, this distinct difference between before Hotel Rwanda came out and after Hotel Rwanda came out about the level of people's understanding of what had actually happened and how much they cared. We don't need to necessarily have a Hollywood film, but I'm saying that really being able to disseminate the story in a way that emotionally connects with people. It's not just my suffering is worse than this community suffering. It's because we have 1 million people or because we have this many people of sexual gender-based violence. That's all important. Reports are important. But at the same time, it's the emotional connection that, and the narrative that I think we really need to be able to communicate in a way that's compelling to others. And it's because it's about numbers, and it's hard to even wrap your mind around the concept of 280,000 women raped. That's incredibly hard to imagine, but these stories I think are really important. So yes.
Yeah, just on that Hazara recognition in the UK, that was my local council that recognised the Hazara, which was great to not have to dip off halfway across the country to go and speak in the Parliament, which was quite nice. But there were so many people who were unaware of the suffering and unaware of what had happened, and normal councillors from normal communities, from farming communities, from rural communities, who didn't have a clue and were so willing to do more and wanting to do more. And the recognition was huge for the local local community in Derbyshire and Staffordshire, and it was incredible to see it happen in such a small council building. But this has galvanized other councils to also start to engage with us in discussions. And this goes for Tigray as well. The Tigrayan communities in exile can do this. Tigrayan communities across the world can do this. They can go to their local councils and get them to make a determination. And it may be in a rugged old city hall with no central heating, like where I was, and it may come at midnight, like ours did, and we may have been there all day long, like we were. But it doesn't matter, because when you get there and you get these little snippets of something, they mean such a lot. So other forms of justice, go for them all.
Right. I would like to chime in here because I completely agree with everything that you're saying, but just to kind of create a bit of to be the devil's advocate, basically, I want to talk about I do agree with everything that you've said. My issue begins with for example, like you mentioned, the recognition of genocide in itself compels and forces action to be taken, right, by state institutions and states. So again, we kind of come back to the idea that it technically is a political decision. So when we have discussed this in the kind of situation we're in, where there hasn't been an actual transition period. So it's the same government that's still in power that is being accused of genocide. So in the international community and in other states, like states in Europe and the US, would somehow want to remain in good terms with the state and those who control the state. In such situations, it seems a bit redundant to push for the genocide designation when there are other kind of crimes that have taken place, like using starvation as a weapon of war, for example. I think Alex de Waal makes a good point when discussing using the term genocide. And even though, yes, it is a genocide, we've kind of acknowledged realistically that these states see it as a political decision. So how then do we create the case for the other elements that have occurred within the genocide? And would that lead to a better case being built for the genocide itself? I don't know if my question's making sense, but essentially what I'm saying is kind of pursuing the things that somehow get overlooked because they get encompassed into this big terminology of genocide and kind of get forgotten about. Things like starvation, things like SGBV, like things that are kind of put into the big word of genocide, but not individually sometimes interrogated. And how do we do that? How do we pursue these things?
Who's that directed to? I guess all of us.
Yeah, to all of you.
I mean, I would say, like, in terms of you preface this statement as a like devil's advocate to what James said, but I think that those are actually very consistent things. And I would just basically say yes and to both of them, right? Like I think with the genocide recognition, because the perpetrators are in power, that doesn't make this impossible, not even a little bit. I mean, if you look at Canada's recognition of the China's genocide of Uyghurs, the genocide of Tamils in Sri Lanka, these are two cases that immediately popped into my head about, perpetrators are still in power. And in Sri Lanka in particular, you have like many years now of UN reports confirming that the current government continues to block the prosecution of emblematic cases domestically. So there's and they keep also saying that they're going to cooperate and they don't. So there's all sorts of precedents for this, and I don't think it's impossible at all just because the perpetrators are still in power. But I completely agree with you that we shouldn't just focus on genocide. And even I would go further. It's not just the crimes that are subsumed within genocide, those four actus reus elements. There are all sorts of other crimes against humanity, war crimes, other violations of international law that you can look at and seek recourse for. So I do think that's important. And the special rapporteurs were, in a way, although I didn't say so explicitly, an example of that. Because I don't believe there's a special rapporteur of genocide, unless I'm just, completely blanking on one in this moment. But there are special rapporteurs for a whole host of other crimes that have happened with Tigray as well as genocide. So I do think so. It would be easy in a way to get laser focused on just one violation or one category of violations to the exclusion of others. And I do agree with you that the Tigrayan community should probably not do that.
Yeah, I'll just come in just slightly on that. I'm trying to think who I was in a talk recently, and there was talk of basically there needs to be a new formation of how we look back to, say, Raphael Lemkin and his groundbreaking work on the law of genocide, the crime of genocide in of itself, and to look at how we can move beyond the physical killing, the physical destruction, and look at cultural, social, cultural, political, religious, and also ethnic dimensions of how this is carried out, because in effect the term genocide, we've also got crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, all of these other crimes that genocide encompasses but does not cover in its separate parts. So there is a lot of work being done at the moment on that. I'll mention two scholars, Paul O'Brien from Harvard University. He published an article in June 2025 that looks at how the current law of genocide is not fit for purpose. There's also a UK-led, which I'm sure Sarah will know about, the Standing Group on Atrocity Crimes, which is looking at looking at comprehensive recommendations on how the law of genocide can include these other crimes, and also can go beyond the current legal mechanisms to how we address how they're insufficient to address current global suffering. And again, these are things that are currently being worked on. We can say too late, it's better late than never. But again, there is a lot of work going on around this, and it's incumbent on civil society to go away, look into this, and come back to people like Sarah, people like Joanne, people like myself, who I know I've just given you two some more work there, but who are working on this constantly to say, look, hey, let's do some sessions around this, and I think that's maybe a really good place to go, not just on Tigray but elsewhere, but specifically on Tigray because the atrocities are going so unaddressed.
Can I just say that it's like I'm going back to something that I highlighted earlier, which was that idea that punishment addresses the perpetrator and acknowledgement addresses the victim.
Yeah,
like the victim's need for their reality to be validated. So, and along those lines, like I think when we're talking clearly, what happened in Tigray is genocide, and I think when we're talking to Tigrayan survivors or we're talking about our story with one another, that makes a lot of sense to continue to call it what it is because. We need to validate it publicly and to talk about it that way. But then, when we can separate the two essentially that we're validating this as, our experience, and then about how are we going to actually pursue punishing the perpetrators, that we can emotionally detach from it. I think one of the things is we can get really hung up on like, it's a genocide, it's a genocide, it's a genocide. Look, and like it is, and we can continue to pour ourselves into that. But I think that being able to detach the two and say, like, this is what it is, but there are other ways to hold these perpetrators accountable and just to pour into strategizing that, look, I mean, and it could be any of the things that, we were talking about these different with the special rapporteurs, like so many of them apply, as Sarah was saying. So which one is the most interesting to what group, and could they pursue it, detaching that from it for a while?
Thank you. Okay, so I have one last question for me, and if anyone else has any questions as well, just to finalize, please raise your hand and we can go ahead with any remaining questions. So my question is regarding the transitional. I just want to hear your perspective on this, basically. But the transitional justice that the peace building agenda has rolled out, this is an agenda that definitely predates the war. So it's not technically a reaction or like it's not following what happened in Tigray. Essentially, it's something that predates that. So in context of that, many international kind of institutions and actors have kind of deemed that as a result of what happened, well, as something that can actually provide a solution or a transition to what's happened in Tigray. But in understanding that the peace building process has 3 pillars, and it's very funny because the Prime Minister recently actually mentioned it last month in October, even though many people thought that this agenda had died. So it has 3 different pillars. That's the national dialogue, the transitional justice, and the DDR. And with these 3, obviously the Tigray was an essential part of this process. How do you, knowing what we know, knowing the extent of the crimes that have occurred in Tigray, and you can correct me on this, I don't know if I'm wrong on this, but the internet, like the institutions like the ICJ, for example, are subsidiaries and they may not be involved if there's an actual domestic mechanism for justice, which we're clearly seeing. Whether it's genuine or not, we don't know, but we're seeing a display of. So how then do survivors in Tigray utilize this opportunity and kind of play a part in this? Or should they engage? Should they not engage? What would you recommend, just off your expertise and off other cases?
I'll just quickly dip in on this very quickly. So some of the Tigrayan civil society groups in the UK, we were involved in the Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission's events they held in London, which were totally pointless and unfounded and just an absolute. I was going to say a bad word then, and not a very great. Not a fruitful dialogue. And I think, as you say, with the 3 pillars that are ongoing and the transitional justice process in of itself, it is totally flawed, and it is a pointless process. The Prime Minister of Tigray region was the leader of Tigray region was in the UK recently and sat down with Mehdi Hassan. I haven't watched it yet, but I've heard from many civil society groups in the UK, how pointless and baseless that was as well. And I think one of the big things about all of this transitional justice process is that it takes so much political will to engage with the transitional justice process. It can take civil society to hold meetings. It can take civil society to come up with resolutions and statements and to come up with actionable steps. But actually, so long as those politically in charge treat it as a farcical illusion of justice, or treat it as something which basically gives breadcrumbs to those who seek justice and don't actually engage with it, it will never be something which can actually create any possible justice. Justice, when we talk about justice in terms of people going to trial, or justice for communities getting some form of healing. So the whole process, I would say, the transitional justice dialogue, the DDR, everything else which has gone on with Ethiopia, the three pillars, it's been lost. It's lost, and I don't know how we get that back.
Thanks, James. That's a very definitive response. I appreciate that. Sarah, Joanne, anything to add on that?
The only thing I was going to say is that, when the government comes out with some type of, the only way I could see using it is actually more internationally. And that's to say how epically it's failing, essentially. That, that it, track what's going on, and if there are these statements made about what they're aspiring to do, to be able to just systematically take those statements and show how epically they fail, as a way of consistently reminding the international community, essentially, that this isn't working. That's I think that's how I would engage with it, essentially, is.
Yeah, and I agree. And the only thing I would add is, looking at this from a historical perspective, and I don't consider myself by any means an expert on the history of Tigray, but just from my conversations with civil society groups, and learning that there have been historical genocides in Tigray, after which there were similar flawed domestic processes, and then again further genocides. I think we can see the history repeating itself here, and this seems like just the typical playbook for the government. And, clearly it didn't work to deter. So I also would look at that with a lot of hesitation.
Great. Thank you all. That was definitely a united response I think you all had. So thank you for that. If we can, I think, give closing remarks to our panelists, and then we can go to closing remarks from La'aka. Is that okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. I would maybe the panelists can just give them. There's a bit of an echo. We can give them a minute to maybe close and make their closing remarks, and we can go to you, La'aka, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So let's begin in reverse order. So maybe we can start with Sarah this time.
We also have a hand raised. I just noticed. Sierra, I don't know if we have time for a question.
I did not see. Sarah, you had a question. Sorry, I apologize. I didn't see your hand.
Sorry, not a question. I just want to say thank you to everybody. Sarah, Joanne, James, you've been amazing. Moderator, you're amazing as well, Melet. Nice to meet you all. And thank you for organizing this beautiful session, Abanet. Thank you. Very powerful session.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sierra. All right, so just in closing, I guess the point I'll emphasize and sort of echo again is that justice takes time. And, there's the co-founder of my organization has this quote I like to repeat, which is the wheels of justice grind slowly but inexorably. So all that to say, don't lose heart that this can take years, because that's unfortunately normal for the international legal system. But justice is attainable here in whatever form we pursue. And I'm happy to help. I'm sure Joanne and James and volunteering as well. So we're here for you, and we'll support you in any way that we can.
Given our situation of polarized politics in Tigray, I think it's also kind of common in post-genocide, actually still active genocide societies, as it is also perpetuated by the genocide committers, and we end up having the characters of the genociders themselves divided and attacking one another. In such situations and polarized political state, how can we keep the communal need for both healing, recognition, and justice?
This seems like a question for Joanne.
I'm so sorry, I missed it. How do we build the will for justice? I do see some similar circumstances. The Hazara community is really experiencing this right now. Currently, there's a lot of division. There's a lot of division in the diaspora about how to move forward. Yeah, it does. It happens in other places. I don't know that any of us have the answer. From my conversations with other communities, in the sense of how do you bridge divides. I think it's not helpful to try to control how other people are advocating or to sabotage how they're advocating. So maybe I would say that at first is that if you're undermining what somebody else is doing, just stop. Because we need the awareness, and we need to be if anybody has the energy and the willpower and capacity to actually be advocating, please encourage them to continue, unless they're blatantly saying something that's totally incorrect. And so I think that we need to stop with any of that. And then, but other than that, it's encouraging people to feel that they have agency and that they can actually address their situations, and that it doesn't take outsiders or institutions or large movements, but that there's so much within our capability and how we conduct ourselves and treat our neighbors, essentially. And so, yeah, with all of the political rhetoric that exists, I think bringing it closer to home and what it is that you individually can do, and then not sabotaging others is what I would say. But I don't think that there's a really great answer out there. And there are other communities that are really struggling with division.
Thank you, Joanne. I think that's a very critical message. Do not sabotage fellow advocators. Do not. There's no limitation to advocacy, and there's no right way or wrong way of doing it. I think we all know what our strengths and qualities are and what our capacity is. Therefore, let people be. I couldn't agree more, Joanne. James, I know you've worked with the Hazara community as well closely. I don't know if maybe you can just add on to that. I know Joanne mentioned that the Hazara community has experienced such division. So maybe you could just add a sentence onto, or
Yeah, happy to. Do you know what? Working with it's any diaspora groups. There is always going to be people that have differing opinions on how justice should be served. There are always different people on, because it's inherently a political process. All of this, you can't extrapolate the legal from the judicial, from the moral, from the emotional side of these things, and. Specifically to the Hazara community, there is fatigue. There is a lot of fatigue in the communities about how justice should be served, about what we should do, about how we should go forward. And the thing is, a lot of these groups are diaspora groups that are working to garner some form of justice, to see an end of the Taliban regime in the country and a return to some form of democracy. But we have to figure out what democracy looks like and what that looks like for everybody, because within a society such as Afghanistan, where tension and imperialist domination and conquering of whether it be Russia or the US or the UK or however many nations have pilloried the country for so long, for its minimal resources, for so many different reasons, that actually there is such a divide in terms of what people want and what change people want to see, and within that there are so many different ethnic groups and different different the groups that want different things, and different groups that are fighting different groups, fighting other groups, you know. And so there is a lot of division in terms of what people want to see. But what we have to do is you have to go, right, okay, what is a core aim that we all want? And we all want, a lot of people, we want cohesion. We want people to be able to break bread together. We want people to be able to live in a society free from suppression, free from discrimination, free from the tensions which have built up over so many years. I'm talking centuries here. And so particularly, we have to find those ways forward, and we have to sit down with all groups around one table and go, yeah, we hear you. I may not agree with you, and then we may disagree on certain points, but actually what we all agree on is that we're all here to forge a path forward. And so that's what we have to go for, regardless of whether Hazaras want one thing, Pashtuns want one thing, another thing, Uzbeks want another thing, Tajiks want another thing. There's just so many different groups that we have to figure out a way forward. And some groups say that they are genociding other groups, and we see that in Ethiopia as well. We see that with Amharas, we see that with Tigrayans, we see that and everybody's throwing rocks in glass houses of each other, and we have to find pathways forward. And one of the pathways forward is we all want truth, we all want justice, we want reconciliation. And so if those are the three pillars we go for, we have to just block out the noise and keep going forward.
Actually, that was great. I also have one more thought along this line. This is a strategy probably for another time, but I think we could also bring a bunch of really great experts, I know a few, to talk about this potentially. But there's also the possibility of creating something like a government in exile. When you think of like what the Tamil community has done, and actually the Tibetan community, that, you know, if you can create a space for some of these disagreements to actually be hashed out in a democratic sort of space that's at a designated time, and the community, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this in the sense of like, you know, actually even the Uyghur World Congress does this to a certain extent, but you know, creating some sort of body essentially where you all have a say, everybody has a say, everybody has the right to be able to participate. It can be hard to get the buy-in from the whole community at the beginning, essentially, to say that this is the body, this is the place where we're going to do this. We now have to acknowledge that we have a government in exile, or we have this sort of functioning other space. But it can be incredibly valuable in the long term. Actually, it can be valuable in our pursuit of justice. It can be valuable in garnering resources for the community that you are representing. And then it also creates this space to actually hear each other's points of view, disagree, but have votes on it. You know, you can create a structure around it, a democratic structure. I think that the Tibetan community, I think it's not every month. It's like once every couple of months. There's like 1 or 2 days essentially where people hash out their differences in a hearing. So it's not like a sitting parliament that's all the time, but you have these designated days essentially, and you can elect representatives, and you can go and speak to the whole community and televise it. Have a space to actually air it all out. An idea.
Great.
Yeah, that's one of the things. Sorry, Malak. One of the things is that governments in exile are never recognised by everybody, and we've had this with the Hazara community. I've had letters sent to me from perpetrating to be the Hazaristan government in exile of Afghanistan, and you know, and then you'll share it with other groups, and they will say, you know, there's no such a group that exists, or it's a group of 3 or 4 individuals that have just met up and just issued a letter. It is, and these are things that take a long time to get to a consensus on. It's tricky, but you know, these are all parts of this whole matrix of how you manage the social, the political, the legal dimensions of conflict and post-conflict environment, and also exiled communities who become so distant from one another and so fractured that you have to find consensus to build back stronger.
Yeah, it is tricky. And I just want to point out also the Tibetan government in exile is in a bit of a unique circumstance because everyone recognizes the Dalai Lama. And he's essentially, that's him. I mean, it's his group. He's in the Tibetan government in exile is Dharamsala, right? It's his that's that. So, in contrast, there are other groups where there are multiple governments in exile, as James said. So it is a tricky one. Another potential structure to model could be something like the World Liberty Congress, which is granted a bit of a not perfect parallel because they have multiple communities all represented, but maybe some sort of Congress-like structure rather than a government-like structure where you have, different of these fragments of the Tigrayan community all coming together to dialogue rather than like having one president in exile, if that may be too ambitious. So there may be, different ways to do that. But I think the general principle is a really good one in terms of having a place outside of Tigray where everyone can come together.
One last thought on that. The guy who actually, like one of the, I forget his name's skipping my mind, but one of the heads of the who helped start the Tibetan government in exile, who teaches at Harvard. Is it Lobsang something? I just forget his last name. But I happened to meet him a couple of times earlier this year, and he actually offered to talk about, because he's writing a book about how to create a government in exile, essentially, and he teaches it at Harvard. Yeah, and he offered to talk to any community interested in learning how to do it, essentially, because he's thought about it and been doing it for a number of years, essentially, and the benefits of it. And one of the big takeaways I took away from his conversation also is that if you have a state that is going to actually separate, or if you have a country that's collapsing, how valuable it can be to have a government in exile, because you don't have a vacuum, essentially, that is created that has to be filled. So by putting these, like, engaging these key community members around the world to participate in some kind of a thinking process about how to govern, that you are creating a really important structure that you can kind of drop in when the moment becomes opportune to do so, essentially. So if there was an interest in the community to potentially hear from somebody like that, I think that could be arranged, because he did mention that he was available.
That could be the next event in the series.
Absolutely. I think that it would be very interesting to hear what he has to say, Joanne. That would be a great connection to make. I would also say the thread, I think, from what you've all said is that it all starts with open dialogue. It all starts with consensus building, with open dialogue, and being accommodating to such a diversity pool of thoughts, and understanding that we may not have, and I think, James, you kind of put that very well, we don't envision justice or maybe even democracy and what it means to have, like, to be at the end of what's going on to grow. We don't envision it similarly. And I think that's okay. And I think understanding that other people have different visions to us, and that we may be actually able to accommodate all those visions, is where the work actually starts, having that dialogue. So thank you. I think that was a very good response to a very difficult question, I would say. So thank you all. I think we were I think, Sarah, you had made your closing remarks. I'm not going to ask you to do it again. If maybe we could then go to Joanne, and then we'll go to James just for last comments.
Yeah, I will be very brief. I would just say that I think we should take heart. We should take courage. The future, like I said, begins before political change. And the future is built by those who refuse to remain silent or to ask for permission. So I would just say, let's keep doing what we're doing, but re-engage if you can, and bring others with you.
Thank you, Joanne. If we could go to James.
Ditto, nothing to add. I think what Sarah said and what Joanne said, I can't add anything.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for lending us your time, your energy, and all the great, amazing work that you do. We hope that we can definitely come together and support the work that you're doing. And also we can collaborate in the future. We can continue to collaborate and build solidarity, as you all have done with other communities who face similar situations and similar atrocities and a genocide. And hopefully we are able to move forward and transition to better times. So I would just like to say, on behalf of everyone here, we are very grateful for you all and thank you for the work that you do.
TPM afdegge ዘመናዊ ትግራይ